All right, Claire, our recording has started, so I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce me, I guess.
Well, welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today for Making Your Donor Database Work for You. And we are so fortunate today to have Stephen Shattuck with us. He is the Chief Engagement Officer at Bloomerang, and I think you're going to find him very engaging. So he has an apt title. He's warm, he's funny, he's super knowledgeable. And if you don't know, he hosts weekly webinars for Bloomerang. If you joined us last week for my webinar on how to do a SWOT analysis, you already know him a little bit. And today you're going to get to see him really shine. Stephen got his start in the nonprofit sector producing fundraising videos and other digital content for organizations like the Girl Scouts, American Heart Association, and many others. And today, in addition to his Bloomerang portfolio, he serves on the project work group at the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, which I hope you take a look at from time to time because it has all sorts of really useful data about donor retention. And he's also an AFP Center for Fundraising Innovation Committee member. He is a prolific author and a speaker, and you may have heard him at conferences like AFP or N10 or Nonprofit Hub, NATO, Association of Donor Relations Professionals, Cause Camp, lots of conferences. And in 2015, what you may not know is he co-founded his own 501c3 called Launch Cause, which is dedicated to helping emerging nonprofit organizations in the Indianapolis area. So he's a busy guy, and we are really lucky that he's taken the time out from his schedule to help us look at one of the most important and too often underappreciated elements that contribute to your ability to be successful. And that's your database, what it can do for you and how to use it so that it supports you rather than frustrates you. And I hear from folks all the time who are unhappy with their databases, and sometimes it's just not adequate to meet their needs. Sometimes it's adequate but not particularly user-friendly. Sometimes they're not using it successfully because they don't understand the right questions to be asking of their support teams. And sometimes they're just using it to do mailings, but they're not sure how to pull reports or segment or track actions and things like that. So Stephen today is going to tell us everything we need to know about what the donor database can do for us and how we should look into making it be more of our partner and foundational support, which it really is. So Stephen, take it away.
Wow, that was awesome, Claire. That's like the best introduction I've ever gotten and best description of the importance of a database. So I feel like we could just end it there, but I do have some slides for you all. I think we can go through them. So, but first, I just want to say thanks, Claire, for having me. This is a really nice invitation that you offered me to speak to your community here. I love the clarification community. You all are whip smart from what I've seen. You've been down to the Bloomerang webinars. Yeah, we just had Claire last week. If you didn't see that, she talked all about how to do a SWOT analysis. The recording is on our website. If you want that, I'll send it to you. But it's nice. I've been introducing Claire a bunch of times over the years on my webinar, so it felt good to hear her introduce me. That was kind of fun. But thank you to all of you for taking an hour out of your day. I know it's probably a busy time of year. Maybe you're doing spring appeals or spring events, wrapping up that fiscal year next month, whatever it is. Thanks for being here. Hope you got some tea or some lunch. I got some kombucha, so I'm enjoying that as I'm going to talk about database stuff. So really won't add anything more to what Claire said about me, other than I love this job, and I come from a fundraising family. That's my wife and kid there. We've even got a new addition as of last August, and both are already kind of budding fundraisers and nonprofit supporters. So we're trying to raise that next generation of fundraisers. So rest assured, I'm trying to keep it going here. So you all signed up to learn all about how to make the best use of your donor database. So I've got a few ideas for you, and I'm going to keep this presentation pretty agnostic, no matter what software or vendor you're using. I represent a vendor, Bloomerang, that's what we do. We do donor management software, but I think all the advice I'm going to give you today you should hopefully be able to do in any system, whether you're using Donor Perfect or Neon or, whatever system you're using, no problem. We actually get along with a lot of our competitors. A lot of us collaborate with the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, like Claire said. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So, no problem if you're not using Bloomerang. I'm not going to really give you anything that you have to use Bloomerang for, although if you were using Bloomerang, maybe some of these things would be perhaps a little easier. I'm also going to kind of give you some tips of maybe how to go shopping for a database. I mean, there's a lot of vendors out there, a lot of good vendors, honestly. Yeah, it might be hard for you to make a really bad choice in terms of vendors, but I want to give you a couple ideas of maybe how to make the best choice for your organization, because not everyone's going to be a good fit for Bloomerang or any of the other vendors out there. So my little thesis statement for you is I'm going to talk about what is the actual purpose of a donor database. And there's lots of different ways to kind of define this. I think Claire did it pretty well. I as I was hearing Claire describe donor databases, what I kind of was thinking that it's not just a passive bucket of names that we sort of organize into a donor pyramid by the gift amount. This is what I see most people sort of treat their donor database as. And, there are some legitimate reasons to organize your supporters or your donors into sort of segments based on how much they give. I feel like if this is the only thing we do in our database, if it's just sort of ranking people by the amounts that they give and then just being kind of this passive data repository, you're not going to get a whole lot out of the system, maybe more, as much as you could, if perhaps you sort of organize your people maybe by how much they really like you or show engagement with you. I love this donor pyramid. I think this is a much more useful way of looking at our sort of community of supporters, because you can have people in all of the levels of these pyramids that are at different gift amounts. You can have someone who gives you $50 a year who absolutely loves you, and you can have someone who gives you $5,000 a year, and they're on that kind of bottom rung of the pyramid. So when we look at our list of supporters, our database, our constituency, in terms of who really is our most raving fan, who are the most engaged people, and who are some people that maybe we need to spend a little bit of time on and hopefully move them up that ladder or that pyramid, I think this is a much more useful and sort of proactive way of looking at our database. So the rest of my presentation for you is kind of geared towards this concept. And like I said, there are some really good reasons to organize your donors into groups based on gift amount, but don't stop there. When you look at engagement levels and commitments and things like that, then you can really make some interesting choices, do some really cool segmentation, personalization, all that good stuff. So I think the question now is, if you kind of buy into that idea, the question is, okay, how do we get people into that love section where maybe planned gifts happen and monthly donations and major gifts, all that good stuff? How do we get them into that top portion of the pyramid? Well, it's tough, for one, and it's also not something that is super common in the nonprofit sector. So I kind of equate the top of that pyramid to high levels of donor retention. And if you follow Bloomerang, if you've heard me speak before, you probably have heard me talk about donor retention. I love donor retention. We love it at Bloomerang. We think it is like the most important thing that you can be measuring at your nonprofit, even more than revenue and lifetime value and how much is being raised through donors, because donor retention really informs all of those great things. And if the purpose of your database is to retain the donors you already have, you have a really great goal in mind, and you're going to be doing some great things versus just treating your database as just a bucket of names and a bucket of transactions. But when you look at it through the lens of how can we use the database to retain donors so that we do move them up that sort of engagement pyramid, that separates the really successful fundraisers and nonprofits from those that are just kind of maintaining the status quo. So in terms of retention, Claire mentioned this in the intro. There is an entire organization that is devoted to studying donor retention. That's FEP, the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. It's really cool collaboration between AFP and the Urban Institute. And like Claire said, I volunteer my time there. It's an awesome group. It's really a collaborative group between not just AFP and the Urban Institute, but many of the donor management software vendors. So Bloomerang, Donor Perfect, Neon, we actually all collaborate. We send them our anonymous customer data, and every year, actually now every quarter, they release a report just kind of showing how well we are doing at retaining donors in the nonprofit sector. And this has been going on for over a decade. The data set now is over like $9 billion in annual transactions, I believe. So it's a really pretty good picture of how we're doing overall here in at least North America at retaining donors. So I want to share with you the most recent data from FEP. And I think this will kind of underscore why I'm suggesting you use the database in the ways I'm going to suggest, because we really have a donor retention problem here in the sector. Our average donor retention rate is only 46%. That means over half of the donors that give to us every year never give again. So we're losing half of the donors that give to us every single year. That's massive. That's a massive amount of lost revenue. That's a massive amount of fundraising, marketing costs to try to bring those people back, and they're never going to come back. At least they come back at a very small rate. I'll show you that here in a second. And this is kind of dwarfed by, customer retention rates in the for-profit sector. And I know that's kind of an unfair comparison. Customers are different than donors in a lot of ways. But for-profits, they have, customer retention rates goals upwards of 90%. But for nonprofits, we kind of settle for 40 to 45% every year. But the real killer stat that I want to talk more about is that first-time donor retention rate. You can see it's only 32%. So on average, 2/3 out of every donor who gives their first gift to us never gives a second gift. That to me is really depressing, right? Because that can mean a lot of lost ROI in terms of our fundraising efforts. So if you maybe spend $20 in marketing costs or overhead to acquire a $10 donor or a $15 donor, well, you've got negative ROI right off the bat, right? And then if you are spending more money to try to get that second gift and that second gift does not come in, you're losing money on that donation in a lot of ways. But you can see if you can get a repeat retention or a repeat gift, and if you can get a monthly commitment from donors, the retention rates really skyrocket. And monthly giving, that's really the key to donor retention. Those people remain with you upwards of 90% of the time. You really kind of have to screw up to lose a monthly donor. It's possible, but if you can move people kind of to the right of that spectrum, you're going to have much higher donor retention rates. And I think that our database's primary purpose should be to move people across that spectrum into their second gift, into their third gift, into their 10th gift, maybe to a monthly commitment, and so on. That's really the best use of the database, not just being this kind of passive list of transactions and contact information. And like I said before, it's really, donor retention as an average really hasn't changed that much since FEP was formed. It's kind of hovering in that low to mid-40s percentile. It got as low as 39% back in 2012, which was actually observing the 2011 fundraising year. So we think maybe that was just the recession catching up perhaps. And it's made some improvements over the past 5 years, but still pretty low, right? Less than 50% retention. I show this graph because I think there's a real opportunity for nonprofits to kind of stand out amongst the crowd, maybe other organizations in their community or within their cause type, to focus on stewardship and acknowledgement and storytelling and all those great things that keep donors retained, because most nonprofits don't operate under that kind of paradigm. They're very focused on, new donor acquisition, let's get new donors in the door, let's get new revenue, and it's kind of this, very insidious treadmill that we're caught on. We got this leaky bucket that we constantly need to refill. Well, I say, let's stop that bucket from leaking, or at least slow that leak down as much as we can. And you're not going to get to 100% retention. That's not the point of this presentation. But I think we can certainly make improvements. Let's go from 45% to 50% to 55%. Those small changes in retention can mean a lot of extra money, even though it seems like just a small improvement. And I'll kind of illustrate that here in a second. A couple more data points from the FDP research. One kind of bright spot we're excited about is that that new donor retention rate is actually on a 5-year incline, which is great. So we're making improvements on the first-time retention rate. So we went from 25% to about 32% over the last 5 years. That's good, but it's still kind of a low rate, right? It's less than a third of donors who give a second time. And I'm going to give you some very specific ideas how to improve this number at your nonprofit using your database. Because I think this is kind of job one, right? We need to move those people from the first gift to the second gift. And then once they're there, you're in pretty good shape. You kind of get into that low 60th percentile. But that rate hasn't changed much over the last 5 years or so. It's kind of like that 2% of GDP, right? It doesn't change very much year to year. But we want to get donors there so that they do stick around for much longer. One area where we do have some concerns with regards to the FEP data is the recapture rate. So this is the percentage of donors who has lapsed, but then comes back after missing a year or two of regular giving. So that's only about 5% of donors. So if you're sitting there saying, well, maybe we're going to lose some donors here and there, but we can eventually win them back. If donors give on their own time, that's by and large very true. But if you don't do anything, if you're not proactive about maybe stewarding donors or reaching out to lapsed donors, only about 5% of those people are ever going to come back on their own. So once they leak out of that bucket, they really sort of are gone for good. At least 95% of them are gone for good. So who cares, right? I know that's a lot of data, and it's kind of hard to kind of crystallize what that actually means for your particular situation. But I think this graph here illustrates it pretty well. What actually happens inside of our donor databases at these types of retention rates. So check out the bottom row, the 60% attrition rate, which is a 40% retention rate. So a little bit lower than the national average, but kind of still in that ballpark there, 40%. Well, at a 40% retention rate, if you have 1,000 donors in your Bloomerang or your eTapestry or whatever you're using, well, right after 1 year, you're down to only 400 donors from that original 1,000. So 600 donors, they're gone, right? So that's a big chunk of people to not be giving to our organization again. And then over the course of 3 to 5 years after that, that pool of 1,000 donors shrinks to just 10 donors from that original pool of 1,000. So I don't know about you, but me as like a nonprofit founder, that doesn't sound very fun to have to go out and convince 990 new strangers to give to our organization just to break even, right? Just to get back to where we were 5 years ago. And just as an aside, if anyone here is maybe a major gift officer or does plan giving, that 10 donors, that's probably represents your best prospects for major gifts or maybe bequest marketing, because you know that you need people to be giving to your organization for at least a little while before you start maybe management or maybe bequest marketing or something like that. So I think, as an aside, I think this retention issue is maybe why major gift fundraising is so difficult sometimes, is we don't have a really good, a large list of prospects that have been giving for a while, seem to really like us, we like them. It's not likely that you're just going to get $1 million gift from a complete stranger or a new donor. So if you care about those more advanced types of giving, legacy giving, plan giving, you should also care about retention. You want to keep people in the fold for much longer. What about dollars raised? Well, this is a super busy slide, so I'll try to sum it up kind of quickly here. This is just a quick illustration of two organizations, fictional organizations. One has a 41% retention rate and one has a 51% retention rate. And that doesn't seem like a big difference, right? That's 10%. That doesn't seem like a giant change in retention. But you can see the organization who has a 51% retention rate, they're raising about $500,000, a little bit less than $500,000 more than their counterpart at 41%. So I tell people, shoot for an improvement in your retention rate. If you know your retention rate, if you don't know your retention rate, that's probably job one, is to calculate that for yourself. But once you get there, if you're at 41%, let's aim for 43% or 45% next year. You don't have to make a huge change in retention to see a lot of extra revenue from those efforts. And the one thing that this slide doesn't illustrate that may be even more compelling is, these people who are giving longer, that's great, you're getting revenue from them, but maybe they're doing other things. Maybe they're volunteering for you, maybe they're serving on a board or a committee, fundraising for you. I mentioned before they're probably better major gift or plan giving prospects than those new donors. So there is a lot of other benefits to keeping those people into the fold beyond just the dollars that is coming from their increased donations. So just a small change in retention can mean a big difference. So when I say that the donor database's main job should be to keep the donors you have, it really does result in additional revenue because it's higher lifetime value donors, and some of those other cool things happen when they stay in the fold. And we have research, I alluded to this before, but it's true. The best prospects for bequests specifically are those people that have been giving for 5 or more years or been giving to you over a long period of time if maybe they've missed a couple of years here and there. It's not rich people. It's not old people, although those are interesting, perhaps, attributes that you might want to track in your database for sure. But the best people are those long-term givers. So hopefully you agree that this retention goal is a worthy goal to have within your database. Keep the people you already have. And I'm not saying that you should stop acquisition efforts. That's not a very good recipe for success. But if your main focus is retention and acquisition is kind of a cherry on top, you're going to be in much better shape rather than if it's the reverse. Because if it's the reverse, you're going to spend a lot of time and money acquiring new donors. It's harder, it's more expensive, it's more time consuming. And I don't think it's as fun as retaining the people that you already have. And hopefully you'll agree by the end of this presentation. Okay, so how are we going to do this? How do we actually use the database to improve our retention rates, keep the people who are already giving in the fold? Well, I thought I would share with you some research that really kind of unpacks the reasons why donors leave and why donors stay. And I think we can kind of reverse engineer those reasons into actionable insights for how we use our donor database. So the first piece of the puzzle, why do we have these retention rates? Why are we at 45% average? Why are we at 32% on the new donor side? What's going on here? Well, Adrian Sargent, kind of a mentor of mine, he's like the godfather of donor retention. He's been obsessed with donor retention for decades. He's been studying it long before AFP was even formed. He did this study back in 2001, and you can check out the link. You can read the whole study on your own time if you want. It basically dives into this question: why do donors stop giving? Why do they lapse? What do nonprofits do, not so well to maybe alienate them or have them drop off? What happens in their life that maybe causes lapses in giving? He surveyed a large list of lapsed donors that came from about 10 super large national, household name nonprofits here in the state. And enough lapsed donors actually responded to him to make the study reliable and accurate and all those good things. So here are the top reasons that he got from these lapsed donors for why they stopped giving. And I know they don't all add up to 100% because he sort of combined similar answers and aggregated them, and people could answer, multiple reasons at a time. But pretty interesting. And as we're going through these, kind of ask yourself, what's controllable by us, and maybe what are some things that we can't really do anything about, but we'll still talk about ways that our database can kind of mitigate those things. So kind of depressing. I think a lot of these are controllable by us, if not totally. Like I said, we're not going to get to 100% retention, but I think that there's a lot of room for improvement here for sure. So 5% of the lapsed donors thought that the nonprofit they had supported no longer needed them. So maybe there wasn't a clear case for support or a compelling ask. Maybe the asks completely stopped. Whatever that reason was, they stopped giving. They didn't really feel like they were needed anymore. 8%, and this is kind of a theme that we'll talk a lot about over the next 40 minutes or so. They wanted to know how their donation was spent, and they didn't receive that information from the nonprofits. They wanted stories, they wanted success stories, impact reports, case studies, who are the kids being helped, who are the animals being adopted. donors really crave that information. They kind of see their gift as an investment. They didn't get that information, so they stopped giving because they didn't really think or know how their donation was being used. 9% had no memory of supporting, which I always think is kind of weird when I show this, but perhaps it was because they never got thanked. 13% never got thanked for donating. So this is an easy one. The donor database should, of course, empower you to acknowledge the donors you have. It seems like it shouldn't be said, but there are some organizations that maybe have thresholds of giving. We don't thank donors under $50 or $25. That I still see that a lot, believe it or not. And if you're an organization that does that, stop doing that, please. Every donor deserves to be thanked. 16% had passed away, but there are things we can do with our donor data to sort of mitigate the threat that causes to our data and our fundraising efforts. We'll talk about that. 18%, we're going to talk a lot about this, they received poor service or communication. So maybe their giving channel or communication channel was not honored. They said, don't call me, but you still called them. Maybe they are referring to a spouse when it was the other spouse or partner that was actually the person that was giving. All those types of things, sending communications or newsletters or tasks or appeals that do not make sense for the recipient. We're going to talk a lot about that. That's a big chunk. 36%, a little over a third, thought that other organizations were more deserving. And I think that goes back to the acknowledgement and the storytelling. How is the gift being used? If you're doing those things, I think you can lower that amount. And then a little over half said that they could no longer afford their gift. So this is one where you might want to kind of ignore it, but there are some things you can do here. I think one thing we don't do a very good job of in terms of data management is maybe keeping an eye out for downgrades and maybe even encouraging downgrades. If someone calls in to maybe cancel a monthly gift or say that they can no longer give to you annually, maybe, and you got to be really careful with this. Please hear me clearly. Don't be brazen about this. But, hey, Stephen, we know you can't give $20 a month, but could you give $5 a month? Would that work into your budget? You can still do a lot of great things for our mission at that level. What would you think about that? As it's appropriate, that may be something you might want to try. But also just in general, be kind of looking out for those downgrades as they come in, because you might want to do some extra stewardship with those people. Because people do have financial changes in their life. People lose jobs, change jobs. Babies get born, things happen that change that household budget. So be on the lookout for those things. But, looking at these lists of reasons, I think it all boils down to that communication, thanking, storytelling, impact reporting, and also segmentation. We're going to talk a lot about segmentation in our database, because that's really when you can start to do some interesting things and proactive things in terms of communicating. What about the other side of the coin? Why do donors stay? What do nonprofits do well that keeps them into the fold? I love this study by the Donor Voice. It's the exact other side of the coin. It's a survey of loyal donors rather than lapsed donors, asking them, hey, why do you keep giving? What are these nonprofits doing well to keep you into the fold? And it's the exact other side of the coin from Adrian Sargent's study. Number one reason they think you're effective, because you are telling those stories. You're telling people how their donations are being used, what are the successes of your program. They know what to expect from you. You're segmenting your data. You're sending out personalized communications that make sense for each recipient, but you're also telling those recipients what it is you're going to be sending. In a thank you letter, you can say, hey, be on the lookout for our newsletter. And in the newsletter, be on the lookout for whatever comes next. Always be telling the donor or the recipient what it is you're going to be selling to them. Thanking people quickly, the faster you can thank a donor, the better. So your donor database should kind of be a gift acknowledgement machine, right? You want to get those thank yous out the door as fast as possible. 48 hours, even if you can. There's a lot of data to suggest that kind of 48-hour window is a really magical window. I'll share that with you in a little while. 4, surveying donors. If your donor database can survey donors, that's awesome. Donors like to be surveyed. It's not like when we get surveys from every business we use, every airline and rental car company and hotel. Those surveys can be annoying, but surveys from a nonprofit that just kind of check in and say, how are we doing? What's your connection to the cause? Are we thanking you well enough? Why are you passionate about what we do? Those kinds of things are awesome. I mean, that's the number 4 reason that these loyal donors gave. So if you aren't surveying donors, if you aren't segmenting those surveys by the types of donors that they are, we're going to talk about that in a sec. That's definitely a great thing that you can be doing for retention. Donor centricity, the donor feels like they're part of an important cause, not just that you are an important cause and that you're doing great work, but that the donor is a part of it. So donor centricity, kind of putting that spotlight on donors, that should be a large attribute of your donor communication efforts, making sure that you are, kind of cheering on the donor and not necessarily patting yourself on the back. We do that a lot, especially in thank you letters. Thanks, Stephen, for your donation. We're a great nonprofit, and we're going to do all these great things, and look at all the great things we've already done. But if you can slightly change that and kind of put the spotlight on the donor, you, Stephen, are the hero. Claire, you're doing awesome things for the community here. It's all because of you. That sort of subtle shift can mean a big difference in retention and engagement if you can pull it off. Appreciation, who's being helped. This is kind of a list of 7 things, but it's really a list of maybe 3 or 4 things. Thanking, storytelling, surveying, and making sure that everything that you do is very donor-centric. So if you can kind of change this survey result into maybe something that's a little bit more digestible, we want to focus on those first-time donors and those above-average donors. It makes a lot of sense to maybe spend some time on those donors who are giving you higher dollar amounts. That, common sense comes into play. Every donor is important, but if you can only call one donor to say thank you and you've got a $10 donor and a $1,000 donor, I think you know which one you might want to carve some time out for. But if you can carve time out for all of those donors, that's great. Thanking quickly and personally, making sure those people feel really appreciated. Donor centricity, like I said. And if it's a new donor or if it's a donor where you maybe haven't spent that money yet, hey, not just saying how the gift has been used, but what it will be used for, kind of taking that future tense language. Always telling the donor what comes next so that they are not caught off guard, nothing is unexpected. And then surveying donors, always soliciting that feedback, keeping the lines of communication open. So this slide to me is really kind of the key to donor retention. And if your database cannot facilitate this list of 7 or 8 things, I think you're going to struggle versus maybe some other people, other organizations who have software or the tools to make these things happen. So I think the question now is, how can we use the donor database to make those things happen? The appreciation, the storytelling, the donor centricity, the communications. Well, my first sort of advice to you is segmentation. If you do nothing else other than segmentation, I'm going to suggest a bunch of things in the last half hour of this, but if you do nothing else other than segmentation, you're going to be above and beyond most of the nonprofits here in North America. If you can organize the people in your database into groups that are contextual, that make sense for the type of group that they are, and then communicate uniquely to those groups of people, that's when really awesome things happen. This is what separates, at least from what we can see, the successful Bloomerang customers to maybe the ones that are just kind of surviving and kind of just maintaining the status quo. So a good segmentation strategy really has no limits. You can go as in-depth and slice your database into as many different groups as you can. If you don't have a lot of time or man or woman power to make that happen, what I say is at a minimum, you should be communicating to brand new donors differently than the repeat donors or the active or existing donors or whatever you call them in your database. Because right there, those are 2 groups of people. Those are different constituencies that are very different from each other. A new donor should be communicated to in a way that maybe someone who has been giving 5 or more years or even a couple years should be communicated to. And they're not wildly different. If you do nothing else other than call the donor the type of donor that they are in your communication, that's great. By the way, donors really like that when you can say, hey, Stephen, thanks for becoming a donor to our organization. We're so happy to have you as part of the family, versus, hey, Claire, wow, you've been giving to us for 5 years now. You are so awesome. I mean, you are really the lifeblood of this organization, donors like you. You've done so many great things over the years. That's segmentation. The rest of the acknowledgement, the appeal, the newsletter, whatever it is you're sending, can be the same. But if you are at least acknowledging the donor as the type of donor that they are, you are doing segmentation. But you don't have to stop there. I think there are lots of different things you can do with the 2 different types of donors beyond just acknowledging the type of donor that they are. You know, a new donor, you might want to invite them in for a tour or send them a quick survey, ask them questions, because you don't know that person, right? You don't know why it is that they gave necessarily. You don't know too much about them. Versus a repeat donor who you might have a relationship with, you might have picked up some bits and pieces about their personal life over the years. You might want to do different things with them, maybe move them into monthly giving or volunteerism, maybe invite them to be on a committee or something like that. At a minimum, this is my favorite segment. And if your database can report on these things, I think a report that shows new donors this week or this month, that can be really useful to you. And you should be celebrating those people. You should be welcoming them. You should be maybe sending them surveys or inviting them in for tours or things like that. But you don't have to stop there. You could add in monthly donors. You could add in gift amounts. So maybe you have new donors who are above $100 and new donors who are below $100. You know, if you have a high gift amount and you can't make a phone call to every single new donor, maybe calculate that average gift amount and say, well, let's call people who gave a large amount of money as their first gift. You know, that makes a lot of sense if you have a high gift volume. I'm not a huge fan of segmenting by gift amount, but I think there are a lot of certainly good reasons to do it. Repeat donors, you can also break into groups, maybe people who have been giving 5 or more years versus people that have been giving maybe 1 to 5 years, people who give multiple gifts within a year versus people who just have that 1 annual gift. Really, the sky is the limit. You can do any kind of segmentation you want, but I think this is something that our database should really sort of help us do, is communicate to different types of donors differently than other types of donors. It seems kind of like a novel approach, but where I see most people fail is they've got everyone in the database, and we're going to send the same spring appeal to everyone. We're going to send the same newsletter. Everyone gets the same gift acknowledgement regardless of the gift amount, the frequency, the recency, the channel of giving. Channel is another one. You know, you may communicate to people that give online versus direct mail versus an event versus peer-to-peer. Those are all really great segments of people. And all it is reports. These are just kind of standing reports in our database that we look at and that we communicate to differently than other people. Let me show you a real example of what I'm talking about. This is kind of one example of an extreme segmentation strategy, although I use extreme as kind of a compliment. This is a Bloomerang customer, one of my favorites, Heather, up in upstate New York. She's at an education foundation, so she has some really interesting segments of people. She has donors, but within those donors are various different types of people. You may have parents of current students. You may have donors who don't have kids in the school system, but they still give because they see the value of it. You may have, she has parents of former students, so they have graduated, but they still give. And then within those segments, she looks at things like gift amount, frequency of giving, recency of giving. So you can see she has almost 24 segments here of different types of appeals and acknowledgments and newsletters and stewardship pieces that she is sending. Now, this takes a lot of work for sure. It would be really easy to just send the same appeal to everyone in the database, whether they're a current parent or a former parent or not a parent. But she goes the extra mile. And by the way, she raises a lot of money. They do a really good job because they invest in this effort and communicate differently to these people. These are very different stories. Something that you might say to a non-parent, hey, thanks for giving to our education foundation. You see the value of a strong education system in this community. even though you don't have kids in the system, wow, that is really awesome. We can't thank you enough. Versus maybe a former parent, hey, your kids went to our program. You saw the value firsthand of what we bring, and now we're asking you to give the next generation of students that opportunity. And I'm not a great copywriter, as you can probably surmise. I'm just kind of ad-libbing. But those are kinds of the different things you would say to those segments. And again, in the database, all this is a report, right? You're just reporting on these different kinds of attributes. But each kind of bucket of names or donors is getting those different communication pieces. So if you're a school foundation or an education foundation or a private school listening to this, like, here's your segmentation strategy. I got it right here. You can steal it. You won't mind. Think about what are those other types of constituencies within your organization. You know, if you're a YMCA, it may be members and non-members, and then slicing those into subsegments by recency and frequency and gift amount, you know, things like that. But when you are looking at your database, the people in your database, in this way, rather than just that dollar amount pyramid, you're going to be putting together some really interesting and personalized and contextualized communication pieces that are going to hit the mark versus a kind of a generic piece of communication that doesn't apply to anyone and it's going to have a much lower response rate. So kind of my favorite segments, you know, the first-time donor, I think that's the most important thing. If you do nothing else other than first-time donors, you're going to be in better shape than if you're doing no segmentation. And don't forget, there can be subsegments within that. It could be a one-time gift, or it could be a new monthly donor commitment. You know, hey, Claire, thanks so much for joining our monthly giving program. You know, we're so happy to have you in the fold. You know, that can look different than someone who just makes their first gift, perhaps. Monthly donors should be getting communications that no one else gets. It's kind of an elite group, right? It's a little bit of a private club, perhaps. Not wildly different communications, but they're getting different things. If you do nothing else other than call them monthly donors, that's great for sure. Of course, repeat donors, long-term loyal donors. Reason for donating, I think, is a really interesting one. If you were asking donors why they give, sometimes that reason for donating can really kind of bubble those different segments up to the surface. You know, if we just look at, if you've got two donors in your system, for example, they both give $50, they both gave online, and it's both their first-time donation. That may look like a group of similar donors, but if you go the extra mile and ask them their reason for giving, you may actually want to separate those two donors into different segments, because one person may say, oh, you know, I had a grandparent who died from Alzheimer's, and I want to give to the Alzheimer's Association because I want to cure this thing. Versus maybe that other donor who, again, gave the same amount to the same channel, but maybe they were supporting a peer-to-peer campaign, and they don't really care about Alzheimer's necessarily. They were just kind of supporting their friend. So those are two very, very different types of donors who maybe might look the same on paper. So asking those questions. And like I said before, the research shows that donors like to have those questions asked of them. So you're kind of getting a double benefit from that effort. And then gift amount, gift channel is another interesting thing to be looking at. You know, thanks for donating at our event. You know, thanks for giving to Claire's peer-to-peer campaign. Thanks for supporting her 5K. Again, if you do nothing else other than call that type of donor what kind of donor they are, that's good segmentation, and that'll help your efforts for sure. You kind of know what it is you're going to be sending to people over the course of that early, at least that first year of a relationship. This is a sample communication plan from Pamela Grow. She's awesome. You can download this off her website, or you can just kind of steal it off this slide. But kind of know what it is you're going to be sending people over that first year. If you do indeed segment by new donors versus existing donors, make sure you know what it is that's going to be in those segments, and you can plan that out over a long period of time. The beauty of this is it will kind of protect those new donors from getting something that maybe isn't appropriate. When we lump everyone into one segment in our database, you may get a new donor who donates on May 29th, but gee, our spring appeal is going out on June 2nd. They may get that spring appeal before they even get thanked for that new donation. that's the beauty of segmentation, is it will kind of insulate those types of donors from getting things that they should not be getting and that don't make sense for the type of relationship or the length of the relationship that they are in right now. So have a plan. Know what you're going to be doing within those segments. Reporting, I think you can use segments and reports kind of interchangeably. Talked about first-time donors, talked about long-term loyal donors, monthly donors. A couple other ones you might want to run in your system because you can do some very personalized communication with these types of donors. Volunteers who have not yet donated. That's a report you should be able to run if you are logging volunteer hours and also logging donations. Hopefully you're logging donations. And if they have volunteer hours but no donations, that's a group of people that might be prime for a special appeal, right? And don't be afraid to ask volunteers to donate, by the way. Sometimes we're a little timid about that because we don't want to ruin the volunteerism. But get over it. Volunteers are awesome donor prospects. Believe me, they may even think it's weird they haven't been asked. But that's an example of a segment that should get a dedicated appeal that no one else gets, and dedicated communications, because we want to move them from volunteerism to volunteerism and donating. Lapsed donors, a Y bunch or a Psi bunch, and that's pretty ubiquitous in most databases for sure. Be looking at those things. Donors who complain or maybe give you negative feedback, you might want to, again, insulate those donors from perhaps a mass appeal or something like that until you mitigate that complaint that they have. Because if they complain to you and then an appeal, hits their inbox, 3 days later, that's really going to tick them off, and you might alienate that person for life. Like, oh, you're asking me for money? I just gave you all this negative feedback. That's weird. So I think the power of the segmentation, I know I already said it a couple of times, but it's really to sort of prevent communications from getting to people that it's not appropriate for right now. Current or former service recipients, kind of talked about this when I showed Heather's segments at her school. Students, former members, or maybe even people that receive services from you, like an animal shelter, people who adopted pets. I kind of consider them to be service recipients in some ways. If they receive services from your food bank or legal assistance from you, you might want to communicate to those people differently than people who did not receive services from you. Overdue pledges, a great report. That's just free money. That's a report you should all create today. Any overdue pledges, if you've got that pledge date and that amount, be looking at that on a regular basis and maybe reaching out to those people to make sure those pledges get fulfilled. One of my favorites is out-of-town donors. If you are a local nonprofit that has kind of a footprint, like if maybe you are an animal shelter or a conservation group within a very certain geographic area, run a report of donors that do not live in that area. Because those people, something weird's going on there, and I mean weird in a good way. Those are people that maybe moved away but still really like you and want to support you, even though they do not receive the benefit of your programming because they don't live in that area. Those are people you might want to do some special stewardship with, maybe even consider moves management or bequest marketing. I love that. Those bottom two, please create those reports today if you can. Like that's some really interesting. There's some interesting signals being sent there, good and bad for sure. I love it. Other ones to be on the lookout for in terms of reporting. I could go on all day about this, but I'll limit it to this slide. Okay, if a donor reaches out to you and says, I moved or I'm moving and this is my new address, or I changed jobs and this is my new email address, please circle that person, highlight them, underline them, whatever your database, star them, because that is someone who really likes you and didn't want to miss out on any of your communications. So, regardless of gift amount, even if that person's given $5 a month, $100 a year, kind of looks like a modest giver, that's someone who really, really likes you. Upgrades and downgrades. Maybe you can run a report on these are people that have downgraded in the past year. These are people who have upgraded in the past year. Differing signals. Someone might need some extra stewardship if there's some downgrades there. If for upgrades, you might want to make sure that they are really getting thanked. They're getting stories from you. Maybe some special consideration there. These are all reports you should be able to create no matter what you're using. A donor who also has matching gifts come in from their donation, again, that's a high level, that's a high signal of engagement. They went through the process, and sometimes this is a pain, of getting their employer to match their gift because they really like you and they wanted to double the donation that they gave. So that's another person you should highlight. Another one, and this speaks to perhaps deceased donors, although it can also be active donors, is household information. If you know of children, especially daughters, because women tend to be more philanthropic, of parents who are long-term givers, those are people you also want to encourage, because, and that's research-based. That's some research out of the Ivy School of Philanthropy that found that those daughters of long-time donors, they kind of typically get indoctrinated into that cause, and they are likely to continue giving to you if those parents pass away, keeping that legacy going. So definitely be recording that household information. You know, data on children can be really useful for you down the road. Aging childless donors, these are good bequest prospects. I know I told you that those long-term loyal donors are the best, but aging and childlessness is also a really good signal that they don't have anyone to leave their estate to, so they might want to leave that estate to you instead. So that's someone you might want to move into, like bequest marketing, if you're doing that. Donors who just have their first child, that's again someone you might want to include in bequest marketing. I know that kind of runs counterintuitive because those people might be in their 20s or 30s and they don't necessarily bubble up to the surface in terms of planned giving prospects. But what they're doing in those years is probably putting together their first will. So if you are building a relationship and you know about the donor's personal life, they just had their kid, you might want to consider asking them to include you in their will because they're putting that together for the first time. Someone who organizes volunteer trips. So if you rely on corporate volunteer trips, there's usually one person that is organizing that or is suggesting that you be the nonprofit that is supported. You definitely want to circle that person for sure. Same as the person who chooses to sponsor you through a corporation. And then one interesting signal of capacity that we have observed amongst Bloomerang clients at least is that donors who write checks as their donations tend to have a higher capacity of giving versus people who put donations on a debit or credit card. There's a little bit of correlation with age. Older donors tend to write checks versus credit cards, and the older donors tend to have higher capacity also. That's also something you might want to look at if maybe you are doing planned gift marketing or maybe even moves management for sure. Donor centricity. This is a Bloomerang screenshot. You don't have to have Bloomerang to do this, but if you have Microsoft Word, you can Google these tests. But make sure that your communications are donor centric, right? You should be using twice as many you words as I and we words because you want to put that spotlight on the donor. And ideally, you want a reading level between 6th and 8th grade. So always be kind of auditing the communications that you send out. We like this because you can do it right in Bloomerang. You don't have to use a separate program. But make sure it's readable and make sure it's donor-centric for sure. Surveys are awesome. If your database can send out surveys, that's great. We do that in Bloomerang. If you don't have Bloomerang, you should still be surveying donors and you should still be recording those survey results on that constituent's profile to see maybe who really likes you and maybe who needs a little bit of help in terms of stewardship for sure. Things that you should be asking there are, how are we doing communicating to you? Was it easy to donate today? You can maybe audit your technical abilities there. Why did you first give? What's your connection to the cause? Why are you passionate about our cause? Those are all great things that you should consider asking within your database. One way that we have found of maybe using surveys to kind of bubble up the best prospects in your database is to use a survey like this. This is a survey that the Donor Voice gives away. So if you're looking at your database and you're thinking, oh, gosh, I don't know who the best prospects are, we don't have a lot of data here, well, you can use surveys to maybe bubble those people up to the surface. If you ask them a simple 3-question survey, How committed are you? How loyal do you feel to us? And are we your favorite charity? If they give you 8s, 9s, and 10s, boom, that's your bequest marketing list. That's your major gift pipeline, perhaps. At least those are people you should be giving some additional stewardship to. So if you have trouble getting those engagement signals out of your database, a quick survey to active donors can be a good way to maybe separate kind of the wheat from the chaff, or at least see how much those people think about your organization and how much they like you. One of my favorite constituency is lapsed donors, because it really represents an opportunity to be pretty proactive with the data. We recommend that you separate people who haven't given in 2 years, because once they hit that 2-year mark, it's really about a 5% recapture rate, like I showed you before from the data. Be proactive with that list. Don't take them out of the database. Don't remove them. Don't write them off. You can still be proactive. You can send them a lapsed donor survey. Hey, we miss you. Did we do something wrong? What happened? You can spend some money and maybe figure out if you have good contact information from them. Hopefully you guys are doing an MCOA maybe once a year or a couple of times a year. You can find out if those people passed away. We saw from Adrian Sargent's research that 16% of those lapsed donors had actually passed away. And you can find that out. You can spend money and find out if that actually happened in your database. And if it did happen, you can maybe reach out to surviving daughters or surviving partners or spouses and offer your condolences, and stop sending mail to those people, because it's going to make them feel bad to see mail delivered to their spouse who passed away. So be proactive about lapsed donors. I see a lot of people saying, let's just take them out because then our database fee will be cheaper. I know that seems self-serving, but don't do that. You never know when people can come back, especially if you are proactive about it. You can do some interesting things there. There are 2 types of donors that have the lowest retention rate. This is another example of a segment that you might want to set up. Memorial and peer-to-peer. Usually they are supporting someone else. They're not necessarily supporting you. They're supporting a friend or a family member who chose you as the charity to support. So make sure these folks get segmented on their own lists. You may even want to consider not even appealing to them, because these retention rates are like single digit, right? But if you do want to communicate to them, make sure you involve that fundraiser, right? Hey, Stephen, thanks so much for donating to Claire's 5K. By the way, Claire, picks the ACLU, and this is why, and then, this is why you might want to consider supporting us in the future. So always kind of weave in that supporter who actually deserves the soft credit for the donation. So that's kind of my sermon on segments. Hopefully you got some ideas of maybe some reports that you want to run in your database and hopefully start to communicate to in different ways. I think if that's what you use your database for, if nothing else, you're going to be way ahead of the people that are just kind of sending the same thing to everyone in the system, regardless of the type of donor that they are. And I promise you, I give you some tips on how to maybe go shopping for a database if you don't have one, or maybe if you aren't happy with the one you have. I'll just kind of breeze through these things for the sake of time, but check out the N10 Idealware report. That's a really comprehensive third-party look at all of the major providers in there. There's really no sugarcoating any of them. They give you a really honest look at all of the providers, including Bloomerang. I like to go to that first. It's impartial. It's third-party. It's fair and balanced. Check that one out because you'll kind of get a good sense of what everyone can do. Check out the review sites. Your peers who are using these systems can give you a lot of advice for sure. Kind of have to be careful with these websites because a lot of times, we as vendors will just encourage our happiest customers to go write reviews on there. So you typically get 5 stars and 1 stars. You don't get a lot of in between because those are when people write reviews, when they're really happy or really angry typically. But you still will get some good information by reading reviews there for sure. The social media groups can be really handy. I always see lots of robust discussions on systems. People usually are pretty fair in their assessment of things that they've used. So definitely check those things out as well. Whatever you choose to look at, make sure you're asking those vendors to give you a login so that you can actually play around with the system yourself, not just the demo, but also the login, so that you can actually get your hands dirty within the system. I think really that's the best thing you can do, so that you can find out, you can run reports that you like to run, and you can run processes that you like to run yourself. I would definitely check those or try to get that from a vendor. Most of them will give that to you, but make sure you take advantage. They may not offer that up to you, so make sure you ask for it. Some other questions you might want to ask about, company stability. I won't go through all these things. You can just kind of use this as your resource. But have these ready when you talk to a salesperson. Most people don't go this in depth, but the people who do, they're going to make the best decision for their organization for the long-term future, especially with as many vendors that get acquired in this space. Maybe you use a piece of software that has gotten acquired. It's not very fun. These questions will help sort of illuminate whether that may happen to you in the future. So my kind of final thoughts for you, I know we're a couple minutes over, so I'll wrap this up. But, prioritize retention. I think the main goal of a database is to keep the people you already have in the system. And the best way to do that is to segment beyond just people that haven't given since last year, haven't given since, a couple of years ago. Do some segmentation, first-time donors, monthly donors, run those reports, and start treating the people in your system differently than other people in the system because they are very different types of donors that you have. And don't be afraid to ask the questions about it. You don't have to just guess. You can ask those donors what motivates them and what they're all about. So if you like this presentation, I feel a little bit of fish out of water. It's usually me that is moderating the presentations. I'm usually much more comfortable in that role. So if you want to get more advice and probably better advice, check out my weekly webinar series. I bring on a guest speaker like Claire. We've had Claire on a bunch of times. She's awesome. I really carefully curate that webinar series. I bring on my favorite people, and I know it's going to be good advice. Every Thursday, we've got Tom Ahern tomorrow. Going to be a great session, but we have lots of every single Thursday, so there's lots of sessions out there you can register for. I've got more free giveaways on our website for sure. If you want to take a look at Bloomerang, if maybe some of the things I talked about piqued your interest, I was a little selfish in picking out things that I know that we are good at doing. But if you want to take a closer look at Bloomerang, just visit our website. You can download a video demo. You can see a recording of the software. You don't have to talk to a salesperson right now if you don't want to. So you can see the software without getting a demo if you're not ready for that. So check it out. Tell us where you came from. If you came from this webinar, make sure you tell us that that's how you heard about it. We don't always know through all those tracking things, but we like to know if you don't mind telling us. We've got an ebook. We've got a free buyer's guide. I think it's a nice companion to that Idealware report that I mentioned before. So you might want to download that and download our buyer's guide. I think that'll help you if you go shopping for sure. But yeah, if you have any questions, tweet me, email me. I'm usually pretty accessible. I'm happy to hang out and answer the questions that have come in from the chat. I know we're a little over the 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern, but Claire, if you don't mind hanging out and answering questions, I'm happy to do that. If that's cool with you.
No, that is
great.
There? I was going to ask you if you were willing to take a few minutes to answer some of these questions. So that would be terrific.
I love it. Cool. Well, if you have to jump off, no worries. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you got something out of it. We'll get you the slides and the recording, but if you want to hang out for maybe 5 minutes or so, I'll just kind of go through the questions. There's one from May about retention. What do retention studies say about retention rates at different levels of giving? Does the rate change for donors above $1,000 annually? Yes, May. That is in the donor retention reports. That is in the FEP reports. You can find that in the annual reports, but I'll sum it up this way. The higher the dollar amount, the higher the retention rate. Like it, probably doesn't surprise you to hear that. If someone gives you $1,000, they probably are more of a committed person than someone who gave you $10 or $100. So we definitely see differences in retention there. Another interesting place where we see retention differences is the gift channel. There is a marked difference in retention rate between online and offline gifts. So offline being like direct mail or events or in person, kind of those analog. It should be maybe digital and analog gifts. There's about a 10% lower retention rate associated with online gifts versus offline gifts, which is really interesting to me because I'm a huge dork. But my kind of theory on that is there's less of a barrier of entry to maybe donating online, so you can do that with less of a commitment, right? It's easy to give to maybe a Facebook fundraiser or just quickly fill out a form on a website or maybe give through a mobile device versus maybe writing a check or going to an event and, writing a check at the event. So we do see differences in chance as well. So I think that kind of maybe motivates maybe some of the segmentation you want to do, not just by gift amount and gift frequency, but also by channel. You might want to treat online donors differently than perhaps direct mail donors or event donors. Because again, those are very different types of donors, right? You've got maybe less commitment, maybe some unknowns when they give online because they're really just an email address and an address at that point. But yeah, I love that question. That FEP report, there's lots of interesting tidbits that I didn't have time to go into. So Meg and all of you, I would definitely recommend that you do that. Annie, we have a giving society with a 5-year pledge payment schedule. Is that a good tool to help retain donors? Yeah, I love multi-year pledges. I think that's a great idea. Claire, what about you? You probably have more experience in this arena than I do. Do you mind speaking to? Do you have an opinion on multi-year pledges? Kind of curious what you think.
I think multi-year pledges are a mixed bag. On the one hand, yes, somebody has committed over an extended period, and it frees up your time so that you meet with somebody once, and you get their commitment for 5 years, and then you can go ahead and work with other donors. What I don't like about it is there is a tendency on the part of staff to slack off a little bit. So you meet with somebody once, that's actually not a good thing for building relationships and getting people up to the top of that pyramid that you showed us where they really are feeling the love. And you really would love it if people would increase their commitment over time rather than stay static. And there is something psychological about making a 5-year commitment that it's sort of like, okay, I made this 5-year commitment to them, and now at the end of that period, I'm done. And you don't want people to start feeling bad about having made that commitment and a little bit resentful, because things change and you may slack off on how you communicate with them. So I think you have to be very careful about it.
That makes sense. I had never thought of it that way. I'm glad I asked you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. But if you do it, Annie, make sure you have that overdue pledge report, right? If you've got that schedule, whether it be 5 years or 3 years or however long it is, make sure you're looking at that and you can hold people accountable to that lost revenue, perhaps, for sure.
But also that ideally you don't just send out that pro forma report,
right?
And you just don't say your pledge is due. That you actually use that as an opportunity to maybe hand deliver the person that pledge thing and have lunch with them.
That's a great idea. I love it. What else in here? I answered that one. Question from Rick. Why Bloomerang and not Donor Perfect or Neon? I like both those products. We get along with them. They may be a better fit than we are, and we may be a better fit than they are. I think it really just kind of depends on your needs. I think you should look at all three. I think everyone should look at multiple vendors. I don't mind saying that and make the best decision for their organization. Make sure you get a demo of all of the vendors you look at. Make sure you get a login so you can use it yourself and maybe try to run some of the processes that you're used to. I don't mind saying good things about our competitors. I think that there are reasons you might want to buy us versus them and vice versa. But everyone's different. Everyone has a different way of doing things. I mean, nonprofits do, not just the software, but talk to customers who use all those things. Ask those questions of the vendors, get logins, and kind of make the decisions for yourself. But I'm not going to sit here and say that we're always the best choice and every single nonprofit should use Bloomerang. I think if you're talking to a salesperson who says that should be a red flag to you. And if maybe, I think another red flag, honestly, is if they badmouth other competitors. I think that usually is a sign that maybe they have more to say about the other vendors than perhaps themselves. I don't know if, Claire, you've had that experience, but that's kind of what I like to tell people. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not Bloomerang, so I could put in a good word for you. I really like Bloomerang because it has a very strong focus on donor retention. And I agree with Stephen. That is where your money is. I mean, obviously you have to focus on acquiring new donors too, or then you'd have no one to retain. But if you had to choose where you put more of your resources, retention is really important, and Bloomerang is really set up to help you in a very user-friendly way to focus on that. Now, the Donor Perfect and Neon may be too. I don't know. I'm just putting in a good word for Bloomerang.
Yeah. Thank you. I didn't pay you to say that, but thank you.
No, you didn't.
Well, this is fun, Claire. Thanks for having me. I think we're kind of way over time, so I don't want to keep people from their lunch if they haven't eaten. But, yeah, this is fun. Any last words, Claire? Anything you want to say? This is
there is one
right?
question that I see that I get a lot, which is,
okay, go for it.
Is what program would you recommend that encompasses other external vehicles for fundraising, like Facebook and peer-to-peer? And I get that a lot because people are confused about the difference between the database and places where you can do peer-to-peer fundraising or mobile fundraising. Like, how do you coordinate all of those functions?
Yeah, well, this is maybe I would encourage people to pull out their smartphone and look at the apps on their home screen and tell me which of those apps does more than one thing. Most of the people will say, I don't have any apps that does more than one thing. I have an app that is really good at one thing and one thing only. And what I'm seeing in the software space, the desktop software, cloud-based software, is the same kind of thing happening where you're seeing lots of software companies that do one thing really well and they don't want to do anything else. I think the days of the all-in-one system are, if they're not already gone, they are going away. So I would encourage you to go out and find the best piece of software that does the one thing you really want to do well. And because if you go for an all-in-one system, there's going to be one aspect that's not as good as another one. Your accounting people might be happy, but your development staff is going to be miserable, or your membership staff is going to be happy, or your accounting people is going to be miserable. And that's not good. But the trick is, and this is one where it hasn't totally caught up, but you want those systems to talk to each other, right? You want to be able to integrate those systems. So look for a vendor that seems to do what you want to do really well, and then see if they will maybe integrate with your database or your accounting system or your email system or your peer-to-peer system or whatever. Bloomerang, we don't want to be an all-in-one system. Most of the software in our space doesn't want to be, I don't think. And if we went out, we would rather integrate with a really good peer-to-peer provider than try to build peer-to-peer in our system, right? That's kind of our philosophy, because we know if we spend time doing that, we're not spending time enhancing features that help people retain more donors. Does that make sense? So that's kind of my product philosophy and Bloomerang's product philosophy, but I think that is going to be more of the norm rather than the exception, 2 years, 5 years from now. So I would be looking at the integrations and kind of go shopping and don't lock yourself into one provider that tries to do everything. That's what I'm seeing.
I think that's really helpful, Stephen, because I think a lot of people have leaders who sort of come to them and go, what do you mean? Why can't you get me something that's all in one? Why are we having to put this together? and I think you gave a great reason why. So thank you. That was really helpful.
And if you get stuck with this all-in provider, if they get bought by maybe a very large provider in the space that tends to buy people, I won't name them by name, but what happens? Are they going to shut it down? Are they going to strip it for parts? And then you have nothing versus maybe one piece of software you have something changes there and your entire organization isn't kind of blown up for it. So it gives you a lot of flexibility and some protection and some freedom, I think. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that one out. I didn't see that question. Thank you, Claire.
Okay, I think we've answered all the questions.
I love it.
I just want to thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, this was fun. I'll do it anytime. You know me.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Go on and enjoy the rest of your day and week, and go forth and be successful.
Yeah, make it a good one. Thanks, y'all.